with 6 Feet Up. We specialize in developing highly customized open source solutions, mostly using Plone. We've also done Zope hosting since about 2001. In order to get all the Parker and 6 Feet Up confusion out of the way right quick here, I'll start off by saying these other two presenters at 6 Feet Up are not my brothers. Anyway, a little more about me. I've been doing open source Unix for many years now. Spent a lot of time with Slackware, Red Hat Linux, also FreeBSD and OpenBSD. And my main Plone-related role at 6 Feet Up is to help out with deployments. We've deployed quite a bit of sites that have high visibility, a lot of traffic, lots of content. We've done some stuff with World Science Festival, Discover Magazine, helped out with American.com a couple times, and some of these sites will sustain over 5 megabits of traffic during peak hours. So what I would like to do with you today is talk about deployment and share with you why deployment is important, and also show you some of the best practices that we've found can help you guys out with making your deployment more scalable, more reliable, and hopefully make your site have better uptime. So to start off, why are we talking about deployment? Deployment is important because it is often one of the more overlooked aspects of taking your site from a collection of functional specifications and ideas all the way to a completed product. Plone ships to be developer friendly. It's made to be easy to extend and easy to set up. A lot of times with a Plone installer, you can have it going in probably 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So a lot of times the scenario is you've spent a lot of time coming up with your specifications, customizing, paying for development hours. You've also added content, and then all of a sudden you decide to go production, and 2 days later people call you and say, your site's down, I can't see you, what's going on here? So first of all, you run some performance numbers, and you see you may have a bit of a problem. These are some numbers that I ran on my MacBook here. We get about 7 page views a second, anonymous, and 2.4 authenticated. So if you're getting some heavy traffic, it's quite possible that your site will be falling over and need to be restarted frequently. So what I would like to do today is go over with you some deployment techniques that we can use to get those numbers up and see what we can do to make sure that our site is going to be available for our customers. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about hardware and OS considerations. Also go over some caching, some URL rewriting examples, and then also clustering, and a couple of ideas that we should probably implement for maintenance on our site. This is the most difficult question, and probably the most commonly asked one that I get, is what kind of hardware do I need to run my site on? How much do we need? There's a couple of articles on this on plone.org. Generally, it is recommended that you have at least a dedicated server. A couple of the articles that I read recommend at least 1 to 2 gigabytes of RAM. That's probably good for a medium setup. If you're going to do a little bit more, you should probably have more RAM. I mean, long story short, the best way to deploy your site is to spend as much as you can on RAM and then look at other resources later. Because most Plone instances, even if it's not very customized, after quite a few requests, you'll be pushing 500 megabytes of RAM on a 64-bit system. So if you start swapping, then you're going to get into trouble and have to restart your instance. That's never good. I think my slides got out of order here. So luckily, as Zope developers and using Plone on top of that, we can deploy on just about any platform we want. Today, most of the stuff that I'm going to say is related to the deployment on my OS X laptop, but it will apply to just about any other development scenario there is. The only exception pictured here is Windows. It is possible to have a good deployment on Windows. A lot of people do it. The only thing is the principles will be the same, but the details of the implementation would be a bit different because we probably would not be using Squid on Windows and probably not Apache. Also, another thing to consider is a lot of plone users use Linux. So there's a lot of Linux-specific documentation out there. But at 6 Feet Up, we're an all BSD shop. We've also done deployments on a few other platforms, just about every one pictured here. So it is possible to have a good deployment on any one of these platforms. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is caching. I'm going to go over the different types of cache that we can use, how to enable caching in our plone site, and also how to tune cache settings to get better hit rate and better performance and take the load off of our ZOAP clients. So the three types of caching that I'm going to go over is we have the proxy cache. In this case, it would be Squid or Apache or Varnish. Also going to go over the ZO client RAM cache and then also browser cache. Starting off, I'm going to use Squid as an example. We need to configure Squid to allow our domains to proxy through it because we don't want to run an open Squid proxy on our server. And we got to allow it to have ZOAP purge the URLs. And then lastly, it's not as important, but we also need to check the memory and disk cache sizes that we're going to allow for objects to be cached, and then check the refresh pattern. So in order to even use Squid, though, we have to first have ZOAPs in the right headers, so Squid will know what to cache. And we do that using a plone product called CacheFoo. And CacheFoo also comes with a Squid 2.6 configuration file that can be pretty lightly modified to work right out of the box. So CacheFoo is an add-on product for Plone. You can install it through the quick installer. And then you can configure it through the Plone control panel. And this is the first screen that you will see if you click on the cache configuration tool. What we need to do first off is enable it, obviously, and then set up the purge type. So in this deployment, I have set up Squid in front. So when we purge the URLs, we need to purge them as exactly how our user sees them. And then we need to list the domains that we're going to do that for in the bottom, which in this case for me is just localhost. But if you had, example.com, you'd want to put example.com:80 www.example.com, anything that you might use to reach your site. And then these are the default caching rules. By default, CacheFoo will allow mostly just CSS, JavaScript, KSS, and other static files to be stored in the proxy. The content and templates are going to be set by default to be stored in the ZO RAM cache. And the reason for that being is not all the purge URLs that come from CacheFoo don't always update containers properly. So if you were to add a page, it may purge the page cache, but it might not show up in your container because the URL hasn't been purged. And we can go over some of those settings later and tweak some of those to see what kind of performance difference it gets us, if any at all. So we're going to go over the browser headers that are required for caching. What CacheFoo is going to put in there is maximum age and cache control headers. So Squid knows whether it can go to ZOAP or whether it can serve it directly from its cache or memory. And the browser will send a conditional GET request after it receives a cached page. It will use mainly last modified or if modified since headers. So if we send out a page that says it was last modified 2 hours ago, and then we request it again, if it's been more than 2 hours, then Squid will go and go to ZOAP for that. And that's stuff that we can also override if we want to increase the performance of our site a little bit, if we don't add content as frequently. And one of the tools that I like to use for looking at headers is Firebug. I think just about everybody is familiar with it since it can also do CSS and help you out with JavaScript and other things. You can use it to see headers for every request. In this case, this shows a hit from my deployment on this machine. And then the last thing to cover that's kind of transparent to most users is RAM caching. This is where pages are stored for, where content pages, like in this case, the front page is stored here, going back to the container and ZOP squid purging problem. We'll store those in the RAM cache so we don't have to worry about squid possibly serving a page that has expired. The RAM cache is great, it's very fast, but the only problem is the more we store in there, it's going to bloat our instance a lot. And that goes back to using way too much RAM for a plone site, and that doesn't really help us in the very end. So in this case, I'm going to cover some URL rewriting. This can be done within Squid. There's a couple of scripts. The most popular one is the iredirector.py script. It does work, but the main problem with it is that you can't do its fine-grained access controls. If you wanted to block some people or malicious web robots from crawling your site, it's not as easy to do than what you can inside Nginx or Apache or any other front-end web server. So what we're going to do is take Squid and proxy it to, in this case, Nginx. It can also be Apache, Leidy, any other web server of your choice. And we should also use it in case we want to do like a more complex virtual host scenario than what the virtual host monster will provide. And we can also use it to, again, block robots, support SSL, and if we want to store anything other than a plone site on the machine, then we'll need to use one as well. We found that Nginx is probably one of the better proxy servers there is for deployments. It can take, it can proxy for at least 50 or 60 websites, and it doesn't have a very large memory footprint. On some of our shared servers, we've seen it use less than 15 megabytes of RAM total as a memory footprint, where some other servers might use a little bit more. So it's very lightweight. Can do SSL and other forms of authentication. And then the other real popular one is Apache. And there's nothing wrong with using Apache. The main problem with it is that when most Linux distros or even like on FreeBSD, when it gets installed through ports, it installs a whole lot of modules that we really don't need. So on our server where we're already stressed for RAM, we're going to have Apache taking over 500 megabytes, and that's another plone instance that we could be running in those 500 megabytes. So if we do need to run Apache, if we need CGI Perl or PHP, then we can use it, but we need to remove the unnecessary modules. So if we turn on the Squid and put it behind Nginx, I ran some more benchmarks, and in this case, with default settings, we get 31.8 page views a second for anonymous users and 4.1 views per second for authenticated users. So our anonymous numbers are looking pretty good at this point. I threw the requests per second up there because that's what a lot of people are used to seeing, but I like to go by page views because the 437 is an average. The content is still kind of slow, and but the JavaScript is really fast, so it kind of skews the results a little bit. Authenticated users, we're doing a little bit better, but not by much. So we need to address that issue. And we can do that using load balancing, using a simple ZO cluster and storage server setup. In this case, I'm going to talk about Pound. Pound is a software load balancer. It runs on just about anything. I've ran it on Windows before, also FreeBSD and Linux. And it's super easy to configure. It'll also allow us to do session-aware load balancing, which is why we can't do a simple hash configuration in Nginx. It's important that if we have somebody authenticated in the ZOP site, that they continuously go back to the same server from their client. And it'll also allow us to have failover support. So if one of our ZOP instances in our cluster dies, it'll take it out of the rotation. So to our customer, it won't look like the site is down. And we also can control it manually to take a site out of rotation or take a server out of rotation. So if we need to do a release, we can use #CTL. And in this case, on this deployment, I have 3 backends. So if I wanted to, I could disable 0 or 1 or 2 and work on that instance while the other ones are serving our live content. So if we put it all together, we have caching, load balancing, and a Zio cluster set up. And so our final deployment looks somewhat like this. We have a request come in from a browser, goes over the internet, and hits Squid first. And then Squid will decide if we need to contact ZOP for the page. If it does, it goes through Nginx, where the URL gets rewritten to our appropriate virtual host, and then through pound. And pound will choose the correct ZOP to go to, in which case they're all sharing the exact same database on the bottom in there. And there's the line going from the original ZOP all the way up to Squid is what we configured through cache foo to allow the URL to purge when we update content. So that way we know that the page has expired and we do need to go get a new one. So if we put all of that together, if we do the load balancing, caching, URL rewriting, I came up with a total of 35.8 page views per second. This is for a completely stock plone 316 site. 489.2 requests per second. On authenticated users, we did a little bit better. What it mainly comes down to in this case is the amount of clients that we're running. So 7.3 page views per second isn't awful. It's still faster than what we had when we were originally running just one client and running anonymous users. There's still some other considerations that we should look at in our site. We should create our robots.txt file. Not every web robot is going to follow that, but it's probably a good idea to have there just in case, because there's certain situations where if some bot is going crazy indexing your site, that's going to take all the load from every ZOP server that you have and make your site look slow to your customers. We also should have Reposo scripts set up so that we can create backups of our DataFS, and that way if there's some sort of disaster recovery scenario, it will make things a lot easier. We should also implement ZODB packing, which will allow us to keep our data.fs file smaller and save us on some disk space. And also implement log rotation, because at this point with our setup, by default, we are logging through Squid, logging at Nginx, doing some logging through pound, and then Z2 and event logging for every ZOP instance. And that is a waste of disk space, resources, and just becomes a mess because that's more stuff that we have to manage. So I would recommend logging just through Squid and using that if you have to process any site statistics or do any debugging. And then also, these are my photo credits. I used a couple of Flickr Creative Commons licensed images in my presentation. And lastly, we are putting on a plone deployment workshop in November, I'm sorry. We're going to have a lot more talks about deployment there, and we'll go a little bit more over Windows deployment. We should have some people that will help us out with that there as well. And at this point, I went over a whole lot of content really fast, and I'd like to open it up and see if anybody has any questions, if there's any specifics that you would like to see.
What do you do with that setup? That really doesn't handle SSL. Your site's an SSL site because Squid won't cache anything.
Right, and that's where we would go through Nginx or Apache, because we would have squid listening just on port 80. So when we make a HTTPS request, it would bypass squid and go just to Nginx in this particular setup, and it would get served from there. And we could still load balance it through pound, but we'd have to bypass all the caching. So yes, with HTTPS, we will lose a lot of our performance. So it's an important consideration. Yes.
I like the number of CEO clients. Do you have some numbers, like you got some improvements, 2, 4, but it's not reached 10 or 20, or what kind of experience do you have with that?
Well, the main experience I have with that is I use as many as I can until we run into a RAM limit, and that always happens. In this situation, I'm running 3 on my MacBook. I have 2 gigs of RAM, and I've just about taxed that out, in which case it's probably better to run 3 instead of 4, where 1 is hitting swap, and then if we get directed to that one, then the performance is not going to be there.
Imagine I have like 30 gigabytes of storage, like 20 zero clients, or there are better things to do with my RAM.
No, there's really not. I would put as many Zio clients as you could. I've never seen a deployment. We've never done any over either 6 or 8. I would carefully watch the logs of your database server at that point. You don't want to get like conflict errors or have the ZOP nightmare problem of you reload your site and then like everything's gone because it's all been stored in your Zio client RAM. Yeah.
We're doing more things recently to do with multiple plone sites but a single ZDO server, and possibly using different database files.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sort of tips for that kind of setup?
As far as storing multiple sites within one Zio server?
Yeah, and having multiple clients and then having load balancing between the different services. So you're mainly talking about here having a single big
Yeah.
public site instead of a whole lot of smaller sites run through one. So
I mean, mainly not a lot would change. You could still have all those sites served from in the same Zio client, all sharing the same data FS. You could set up different data FS mount points, and then you could have different files for each site if you wanted to isolate them that way. But as far as the load balancing and stuff goes, it could just about be the same.
Just a comment on that. If you have different node points in so frontends would use an additional cache for each node. So you will much more quicker run out of RAM if you do that.
is there any way to, I mean, that's something that I'm finding, is there any way to use a single cache but have different mount points?
No, not yet. I heard that in the Black Forest sprint early this year, Andreas Jung, they were addressing something like how to limit the amount of RAM used by a certain size. Coming up.
Yeah.
We've used supervisor and it's called memmon or something like that to monitor the memory usage of a
Mhm.
particular ZOP instance. Do you guys have anything that does the same thing for swap space for a particular processor?
For swap space, not really. I mean, we do the same thing too, as we use supervisor along with memmon and set like a reasonable level. But we try to do that. We monitor the machine swap, and once we see it hitting swap, then it's time to do something. But I mean, generally, it's not that big of an issue as long as you're careful about how many Zio clients you run.
What's the advantage of running Nginx and pound rather than using the squid load balancing?
The main reason that I chose to include that in this deployment is I think it's easier to rewrite URLs in Nginx or Apache. It also allows us, like almost all deployments will have some PHP site or some Perl script that has to run. So in that case, it makes it easier from like a virtual hosting perspective to use that. Also with Nginx, the nice thing about it is there is almost no overhead from Nginx in this deployment because it is so lightweight, and that's why I chose to include it. Also, SSL support is another nice thing to have.
If you don't need those, then you get the advantage just by doing it on squid.
Yes, absolutely. You could do it that way.
There's also some really nice build-out recipes to do all the virtual hosting stuff within your build-out for Squid and Varnish. So
Yeah, I did leave varnish out. I wanted to have some more time to try out the latest version, but we've worked with varnish a little bit at 6 feet up, and if we have found that the stability's not really quite there yet.
The biggest performance problem I've had in the past year has been these little robots with hammers.
Hmm.
Site. Do you have any techniques for dealing with really nasty robots that come up on
There's a couple ways we could.
well in the server?
There's a couple ways we could block those out. I mean, the main problem with that is it seems to be a different one every day. For the known ones, you can put those as like a deny access rule in your squid. Also, there's even sites out there with a whole lot of Apache rewrite rules that will take some of the common known robots and not allow them to access your site, which is why it's nice to have Apache or Nginx running. You can filter them out at that level, and it's a little bit simpler to do so. But yeah, it goes back to just monitor your logs and put them in there when you can.
Do you find that the authentication mechanism affects performance, like LDAP? If you watch the logs, it's just being hammered, and open LDAP logging seems to be very expensive.
I've never really done a benchmark of turning off logging in Squid or Nginx versus having logging on there. I don't think we'd have too big of a problem, but it would be very interesting to try. And that's why I think that we should turn it off at the Z2 log level, because we really don't need those unless maybe we're having problems with different sessions and we need to see who's going where to each Zope client.
Have you any reasons to put engines behind Squid or engines before Squid? Why this way and not the other way?
I put it behind Squid because it's probably just more of a matter of personal preference. But when I have Squid, I like to say, okay, I have Squid running on this machine here, and I want to allow these 6 domains in there. So I put an ACL in there saying, okay, well, allow localhost as a destination domain, allow mydomain.com and those others, and deny everybody else. So it's kind of easier to start off that way and put them in up front. And also makes the purging more simple through cache foo.
Someone else said if you want SSL, you've got to put Nginx in front, or at least have a second Nginx for SSL.
Would also have SSL with this setup, right?
Yeah, in this case, you would have, I mean, it's not really going to work to have Squid doing any kind of SSL, so you could just bind it to port 80. So then when you make an HTTP request, or HTTPS request, I'm sorry, it'll go to 443, and then it would bypass Squid and go right to Nginx, which you could also bind on that port.
Change your, like, the number of objects from the debug for the ZODB? Mess with
The
those?
ZODB cache size?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends per site, how much stuff you have inside your data FS and how much you want to cache. I haven't really done a whole lot of tweaking with that, but I think it would be something that would be good if you're running into problems with your Zope instances, like bloating up and taking too much RAM. You may try to reduce it.
Similarly, do you reduce the number of threads by default in your clients?
I've read in multiple places, and we have verified it a little bit. It's not huge, but we set the Z server threads to 2 for every client, and have found that that seems to be the best scenario for plone. Yeah.
What are you using for load testing or on it?
For load testing, for all of these here, I used a combination of AB and JMeter. JMeter, a lot of people love it or hate it. I think it's decent enough for simple load testing. I wouldn't really recommend AB that much because it's way, way too synthetic and doesn't really do a lot.
Could you say again features you add for memory usage for Nginx and Apache?
Sure. Nginx, when we're proxying to Zope and not really doing anything else with it, I found the memory footprint to be about 15 megabytes total. Apache, stock configuration on OS X through Mac ports, depending on how many requests have been through it, probably 300 or 400 megabytes. And the thing is, though, we can tune that down. It just depends. I mean, there's a whole lot of Apache tuning things. There's how many threads you want to run, how many requests you want to serve per thread before they shut down and restart. And it's things like that you can tweak to make Apache, better work for your configuration. It's just not a lot of people do it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if it's tuned well, you could probably get it down to those kinds of numbers. I've gone on servers before and tried to see where all the RAM utilization is going, and sometimes you'll see like 20 HTTP threads, and they're just using a whole lot of memory, like sometimes over 50 or 100 megabytes apiece, and it gets crazy. Yeah.
Did you consider HA proxy instead of using pound? It has a quite interesting feature, the least connection routing.
Mm-hmm.
If you have some long-running requests that block one of your zone frontend, and if you have only 2 threads, it could lock up this frontend. Then the HA proxy would directly direct the next request to the first 3 frontends.
We've never really used that one before. Mostly we use pound just because it's really simple. The config file for the pound setup on here is probably a total of like 15 lines, and it's very easy. Yeah.
Very, very simple.
Yeah, we'll have to check it out.
Yeah, have you found, just a RAM question, I found pound to be a bit kind of a hog as well. Have you had similar experiences, or are you okay with the RAM that you use?
Never really found pound to be a huge RAM hog, especially in comparison to Apache. Not really found any issues with it. I mean, what kind of utilization have you seen?
I was going up to sort of 100 meg, which seemed a lot, but
It is quite a bit for simple load balancing. Did you have a whole lot of sessions going, or like authenticated sessions?
yeah, it's multiple sites.
What does your physical machines look like, and how many users do you put on one physical machine?
Is users for each site, or?
For example, if you have a setup and you see your clusters, you're doing load balancing between physical machines, and how many could you put in there for a decent machine? Let's say you use Xeon processor or something.
Well, if we had a decent machine, like most of the stuff that we deploy on usually has like 4 gigabytes of RAM, and I've found that we can probably put, about 8 instances at least on there for bigger sites. For simpler sites, you could stretch a server a lot farther than that. Some of the shared servers I've seen can have as many as like 30 sites on them and 8 gigs of RAM or so.
Do you tweak your deployable interpolable lock variable in Zope at all for your systems?
No, haven't tried that.
Just wanted to add that at University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, we have some pretty good I'm sorry, I don't remember the model of hardware, but we have 50 sites, 50 phone sites running on one Zope server. We have a couple of Zope servers like that, and I'm pretty sure. I mean, we didn't spend a whole lot of money on our servers, so, but some of the sites are not very high traffic.
What problems have you had with Varnish?
With Varnish, I've found that a lot of times it'll be running great. You'll have a great hit rate, a super fast site, and then all of a sudden it seems to be almost out of nowhere, and I haven't put a whole lot of time into debugging it and finding out why. But Varnish will just suck all the resources the server has, and until you restart Varnish, your site will be almost unavailable. Actually, we have the 6feetup.com site running off of Varnish right now, and it's been pretty solid. We haven't had to really mess with it. It's been running, I think, it's probably an uptime of like 6 months or so. But there's been a couple of people I know that have used Varnish, and they have to restart it like every 2 weeks or so because they have outages. And to be fair, I haven't tried Varnish for about 6 or 7 months, so it may be better by now. Anybody else? If there's no more questions, I think we're a little bit early, about 10 minutes, but
load balancing algorithms that try to detect whether something is a robot and sends it over to one particular client, or ways to kind of isolate those.
I don't think we could do that at the load balancer level, at least not with Pound. As far as web robots, it would probably be better to get them out of the way at the Squid or Apache level, unless it's a robot that you want. Is that what you were talking about? Like if it's like maybe Googlebot or something and you want it to, you don't care about performance for that?
What I'm thinking is that if you could isolate the robots to one client, then you could reset that client more often when it grows in RAM and not have it affect, you know, the real users, but still have it, you know. And then you don't necessarily block them, because if you're gonna block someone, you better make sure it's a robot, so you can kind of guess it's a robot and send them all to one client.
Yeah, that would actually be possible if you knew how to identify your robot through some HTTP variable. You could actually put that in an Apache conf and have a separate rewrite proxy rule to go directly to a SOAP client instead of to your load balancer.
You can do that in Pound. It has a number of header checks that you can basically use regular expression matching against. So if you want to use a user agent and you knew what to set route somewhere else. We use it for routing basically all of our sites are behind Pound. We use one Pound instance one cluster Pound instance for basically all public traffic. And first of all, I've heard of many memory problems. But yeah, we do some crazy things with checking on headers and putting some performance lines on it.
I think I saw you back there.
Let's say you don't want to keep the robots out, you actually want your stuff indexed, but like a meter, the request, is there a good way to kind of control the frequency of requests from robots?
As far as metering goes, I think probably a good scenario for that would be like what he was talking about earlier, where you send them all to one specific instance, because they're not really going to care if the page is served quickly, as long as it gets there, and then you could probably restart that instance more frequently.
Do you have any SLA? Some customers talk about like being up, in the number of seconds of rendering update, for example, on the website.
As far as like a guaranteed performance number?
Yeah, in terms of number of seconds for rendering the page, unlike render setups like JSON setups.
No, we don't really have an SLA for performance. I think that would be something that'd be very difficult and risky to implement, because there's a number of things that could go wrong from there. Sometimes we use performance as kind of like a regression test. We'll make sure that if we've just released a site, we'll make sure that it's up to par with last release's performance numbers, and we'll check like that. But as far as a guaranteed performance, no.
But what you do is, and then also you've got request checks in there, and thresholds, you do get paid if there meets some thresholds. Not a guarantee to the customer, but it's something we're always kind of watching in general.
Yeah.
How do you deal with sticky sessions? Do you set a cookie and pound, or do you do it in SOAP plone?
You can set the cookie in Pound, and then if you you can view them through Pound CTL, you can see the sessions in there. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, before you were finished.
What's that?
The last talk, maybe you didn't hear the talk from David Bain about EC2.
No, I didn't make that one.
Yeah, but do you have any sort of experience, or are you doing some like recursion tests on EC2 right now?
We're using virtualization, basically we're doing it on our own, working our own platform for running virtualized servers. Yeah, previously, we actually have been running experiments with our own users, but none of our customers are on AWS classes.
Anybody else? Sure.
We used to
Mhm.
So we had to patch the square to already Apache logs. Then eventually we needed a patch in the picture, so I put a patch in front of square. And everyone goes, the site's better. So the squid logging in Apache format slowed it down. So if you need Apache logs for the picture,
If nobody has any questions, we can go to lunch 5 minutes earlier.